Welcome to the fifth lecture in the series on Nazi Germany. Today we will examine the effectiveness of each opposition group who posed a threat to the Nazi regime. In the first section, we will examine the different types of passive resistance. We will then examine opposition groups formed by the youth or young people. We will then examine the type of opposition posed by Christians. We will then examine the opposition that the Nazi Party faced by the military in the second half of World War II. The technical definition of passive resistance is nonviolent opposition to authority, especially a refusal to cooperate with legal requirements. The term legal requirements within the context of Nazi Germany encompasses many things since the regime was a totalitarian state. This meant it was even a crime to speak against the Nazi regime in close friendship circles, and there was certainly a fear of criticizing the regime whilst out in public, such as in bars or cafes. One low-level way of showing resistance was through moaning or grumbling about the Nazi regime. This included speaking out against policies, such as a woman complaining that she had been fired from her job, or it could be someone voicing their concern for the persecution of friends. Since this was often done in private, it is very difficult to measure how widespread the discontent was. However, when the war turned against the Nazis, morale across the German people declined, and this resulted in higher levels of grumbling. Another form of passive resistance was to tell anti-Nazi jokes. If these were circulated in pamphlets, then a person could receive a fine, as part of the Malicious Gossip Act that was passed in 1934. Therefore, so many of these jokes were passed from person to person without written record. However, we do have record of some. For example, there is one joke about Hitler visiting a lunatic asylum, which does contain discriminatory language against the disabled, but nonetheless shows what people might be thinking about Hitler and his supporters. It reads, "The Führer visited a lunatic asylum. All the patients were told to stand in a line, and they were given instructions on how to salute him. When Hitler approached, they all raised their right hands and shouted, 'Heil Hitler!' Only the last man in the line uttered no sound and did not raise his hand. Red with rage, Hitler stepped up to him and shouted, 'Don't you know who I am? Why don't you raise your hand?' 'I beg your pardon,' replied the man politely, 'I am the doctor. I'm not a lunatic.'" A braver way of showing passive resistance is through public objection. One way to do this is to refuse to make the Nazi salute at appropriate times. This would take an incredible amount of bravery to go against the crowd, as it is far more likely that an informant would report the non-compliance to the Gestapo. This is a famous photograph from 1935 that shows a man called August Landmesser who refused to do the Nazi salute when Hitler visited the shipyard where he worked as a builder. This is because he wished to marry a Jewish woman, but this was banned under the Nuremberg laws. Landmesser was later arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Let's now examine opposition by the youth. Some of this was low-level, as the youth showed their objection through the way they chose to dress and the type of music they listened to. For example, they'd wear American-style clothing and listen to jazz music. The teenage girls would also smoke and wear makeup, as this defied the ideology of women appearing modest and plain. One youth group was called the Edelweiss Pirates. Edelweiss is a flower that grows in mountainous conditions, such as Bavaria. This youth group emerged in Western Germany from working-class origins. They wore an emblem of the flower to show their resistance to the Nazi regime. They refused to join the Hitler Youth and were sometimes known for beating up its members. They also used to smoke, drink and listen to swing music, perpetuating a counterculture and the spirit of rebellion. During the war they acted as resistance to the Nazi war effort by sabotaging railway lines and acting as spies for the Allied powers. However, in 1944, the leader of the SS Heinrich Himmler ordered a crackdown on the Edelweiss pirates, and this resulted in the public hanging of 13 members of the group in the city of Cologne. The White Rose Group were university students, all studying at Munich University, led by siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl. They distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets around canvas and would paint graffiti around the city to spread their message of resistance. Their resistance was short-lived, however. They formed in 1942, and by the following year they had been captured by the Gestapo, and both Sophie and Hans Scholl were executed in public by guillotine. Let's now examine the opposition the Nazis received from religious groups. The main reasons why Christian groups objected to the Nazi regime was moral reasons, since the Nazi ideology worked against many of the teachings of Jesus Christ. For example, on the Sermon of the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek," in other words, blessed are the weak and poor. However, the Nazi ideology taught a form of social Darwinism whereby only the fittest should survive. This meant persecution of minority groups and the disabled. Furthermore, Jesus taught that Christians should turn the other cheek to those who wrong them. This anti-violence teaching meant many Christians were also pacifists, so they were anti-war. The Confessional Church was Protestant in denomination, however it did not conform to the Nazified version of Christianity found in the Reich Church. It is estimated that it had 3,000 members with approximately 60 pastors, or religious leaders. It was led by Pastor Martin Niemöller, who actively opposed the changes to the Protestant churches across Germany. In 1937 he was arrested for treason and served a prison sentence of 7 months. On his release, Niemöller continued to work with the pastors of the Confessional Church to oppose the Nazi regime during the war, until he was arrested in 1945. He was sent to a concentration camp but actually survived until the camp was liberated at the end of the war. Bishop Clemens Galen, not to be confused with Claudius Galen the ancient Greek doctor, was a cardinal of the Catholic Church. He was the Bishop of Münster in northwest Germany. He spoke out publicly against the Nazi euthanasia program, which was responsible for killing Germans who were born with a serious physical or mental disability. He delivered powerful sermons that denounced Nazi ideology, earning him the title of Lion of Münster. As a high-ranking and influential figure in the Catholic Church, he escaped persecution and so survived the Nazi regime. However, he was a rare example. In 1933 Hitler met with the Pope in a concordat and they mutually agreed not to interfere in each other's business. As a result of this, many other Catholic leaders of Germany remained silent. Let's now examine the opposition from the military. In 1933, high-ranking military generals and war veterans had been some of the greatest supporters of the new regime, since Hitler had promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and rebuild the armed forces. In 1939, when World War II broke out, morale was at an all-time high, with most generals optimistic that they would defeat the Allied powers. However, after America joined the war in December 1941, the war turned against Germany. By 1944, there was widespread discontent among the high-ranking army generals. Many were coming to realize that Hitler and his inner circle were unable to lead Germany to victory. This is when plots to assassinate Hitler began to form. The Kreisau Circle were an opposition group made up of army generals, university professors and aristocrats. Many had religious or moral objections to the brutality of the Nazi regime. They had meetings to discuss plans for Germany after the fall of the Third Reich and even contacted the British for assistance. However, nothing came to fruition. They were betrayed by informants to the Gestapo, arrested, and the ringleaders were executed. The most famous opposition from the military was the July bomb plot of 1944. It was a failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life by German officers led by a colonel of the army, Klaus von Stauffenberg. This was part of a military coup to take control of Germany's government at a critical point when it became clear the Nazis were losing the war. During a military briefing, Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb near Hitler and it detonated. The bomb didn't kill Hitler, but it did provide minor injuries such as a burst eardrum. The coup attempt failed as other parts of the plan didn't unfold as intended. Let's now consider whether or not resistance to the Nazi regime was futile. Certainly up until the mid-1940s, there had been no significant show of opposition to the Nazi regime, other than from religious leaders like Niemöller and Gehlen. When the war turned against the Nazis, opposition groups did begin to emerge. However, they were isolated and uncoordinated, often operating in only a small region of Germany. For example, the White Rose Group only made an impact in their city of Munich, and even then, their pamphlets were only read for a year before the leaders were arrested. Essentially, the opposition groups lacked unity. However, the main reason why resistance to the Nazi regime was futile was the strength of the Nazi police state. This is because it worked on paranoia, fear that anyone, anywhere, at any point, could be listening into your conversation. This made it very difficult for resistance groups to recruit new supporters. It also meant that ordinary people feared criticizing the Nazi regime, even to their friends and neighbors. Let's now return to our overarching question of how effective was opposition to the Nazi regime. Firstly, passive resistance was not very effective. It took a lot of courage for individuals to speak out against the regime or even make a public display of objection, such as a refusal to do the Nazi salute. Unfortunately, too many people feared the power of the Gestapo, so remained silent. There were some youth groups who acted in a rebellious manner, such as the Edelweiss Pirates, who beat up members of the Nazi youth. However, they were not actively seeking to destroy the regime and they did not gain widespread support. Similarly, Martin Niemöller was not able to recruit enough followers to the confessional church to make a huge impact, and Bishop Galen was one of very few Catholic leaders who spoke out against the Nazi regime. The most effective method of opposition was the assassination attempt by the army generals involved in the July bomb plot of 1944. This was the closest anyone came to removing Hitler from power. After its failure, the severe crackdown on military opposition prevented any repeated attempt. Therefore, it is fair to say that it was the terror tactics of the Nazi police state that prevented resistance from being truly effective. Thank you for listening. Tune into the other videos in this series to learn about Nazi control over Germany.